Hey cousin, welcome to CoCo Conjure. Here we talk about all things hoodoo, conjure, folklore, and spiritual journeys. If you haven't guessed already, my name is CoCo. If you can be so kind, please leave a like or subscribe wherever you are listening. As of this recording, I have hit over 100 subscribers on YouTube, and I'm creeping so close to 25 dedicated followers on Apple Podcasts. That's pretty wild to me. I didn't expect that. I'm not doing this for fame or glory. I'm doing this because it just kind of fills my cup. And through this, I've got to meet some pretty incredible people. So thanks to all of you for coming back and supporting me. I appreciate it. So, in the previous episode I did on Moses, I teased this upcoming episode. I had ran across the Chesapeake Conjure Society website. I spoke of them before in a previous episode, and I still was not able to catch up to any members or get to participate in any events. Sad facts for me, I guess. But just coming across them reminded me that if I want to embrace my hoodoo and draw upon the world and the legends that are directly around me, I need to, not just look at the low country of South Carolina that nurtured my grandma and her grandma and so on. I need to look at the lore, the history and the magic right here on the Chesapeake, the place that nurtured me. There are two legendary, uplifted, notable ancestors I could think of off the top of my head that were born in Maryland and went on to do some pretty great things for our community, and whose efforts towards freedom are woven into the American tapestry. The first one is Frederick Douglass, whose story is wild, and I'm sure I'll come back to him at some point. The second, as the title of this episode spoiled, is Harriet Tubman. Both of them had supernatural influences on their escapes, but only one of them has a museum on the Eastern Shore that I got to visit. So for my sanity, I'm going to cover this, and I'm going to break down Harriet Tubman's story into 4 parts. So cousin, grab some water and a snack, put your headphones on if they're not on already, and let me tell you about the Moses of our people. Part 1. Minty. Before she was called by the biblical title Moses, or took on the family name of Harriet, our heroine was born Armanida Ross, Minty, to her family. Her mother, Rit, probably also short for Harriet, was enslaved to the Brodess family of Dorchester on the eastern shore of Maryland. They inherited her, for a lack of a better term. Her father, Minty's father, was owned by a completely different family, but he was respected and a skilled enslaved laborer, dealing with timber for whatever that's worth. In those days, all children were owned by whomever owned the mother. So Minty and all of her siblings were born as property to the Brodess family via willed inheritance. It's fair to say that Minty's childhood wasn't like yours or mine. 2 things would have prevented this, of course. First is the most obvious. She's a slave. Her body and her fate were not hers to own. Her mother's job was to care for other children and not her own. So, for Minty, there was no reading, no writing, no arithmetic. And second, she was enslaved to a poor white family, which, already a trash situation made worse. Mr. Brodess was not a particularly financially savvy man, and his wife, Eliza, was popping out more babies than they could actually feed. So as soon as Minty's hands could work, she was loaned out to other white families in the area. Probably the only smart thing Mr. Brodess did that made financial sense. This way, he didn't have to, house or feed another person. And I found that he did that for almost all of Rit's children, except for Rit herself and maybe a couple of Harriet's brothers. Later, when Minty's a full-grown woman, she ruminates, I grew up like a neglected weed, ignorant of liberty, having no experience of it. Then I was not happy or contented. One thing I gleaned from my brief time studying Minty's childhood, I am no historian, this is just what I was able to find. The thing that I gleaned was she was always strong-willed, even when she was young. In her book, Harriet Tubman, Imagining a Life, Beverly Lowry details one of the first times Minty was loaned out. At the age of 6, young Minty was hired out to the Cook family, another poor white family, perhaps poorer than the Broadus family because they didn't have slaves of their own. With the Cook family, Minty was supposed to learn how to weave. And she purposely sucked at it, preferring instead to be outside. Inevitably, the Cooks sent her back to the Broadus family. Then there was the time Minty was sent to do domestic work for a lady only referred to as Miss Susan. Minty's job was to clean the home and set the baby on her lap, that kind of thing. And whenever Minty didn't clean to Miss Susan's standards, Miss Susan would pull out a whip and dole out punishment right to the face. No explanation, no reason. Get it wrong, get the whip. And even as young as Minty was, even when she becomes Harriet, Minty never lets the master or mistress hear her scream or holler or cry. Never lets them see her pucker. In this instance, Miss Susan's sister shows up to show Minty what she was getting wrong. But even in the face of outright viciousness, Minty showed courage and strength during times when others would easily crumble. Still, she was only a child, and she grew up without the strong hand of a loving guardian. Later in her adulthood, she would say, whenever you saw a child worse homesick than I was, you seen a bad one. I used to think all the time if I could only get home and get in my mother's bed. And the funny part of that was she never had a bed in her life. Nothing but a board box nailed up against the wall and straw laid on it. If you were to search Minty's first act of defiance, though, you'll come across the story of the Bucktown General Store. Let's set the scene. Minty is now a teenager, around 13 or 14 years old. She's still hired out, still a neglected weed. Her job, though, is no longer indoors. She's out in the fields growing flax, a beneficial crop used for its fiber to make clothes or meal to make food. It's the end of the day. At some point, she wanders down to the Bucktown General Store. For what or for why, only Minty knows. And as she walks in, she hears a ruckus in the back. A white man is berating his slave. Minty stares there in the door, unable to tell you what's going on. Not sure even if she should continue her business here. But before she can make a choice on what to do, the black slave sprints out the back, running away from sure punishment and towards Minty. The white owner yells at Minty to stop him. Some say she moved to the side to let the black man pass. And, that may be true. It could also be true that she was outright flummoxed and she just wanted to get out of the mayhem. The intentions are only for Minty to know, but we can know for sure that the black man ran full speed past her and out of the store. Full of rage from the showdown, the white man picks up the closest thing to him, a 2-pound weight, and chucks it right at the door. The white owner's hope was to hit the fleeing black man in the back. His aim, however, landed the weight square against Minty's forehead, knocking her clean out. There she lay, sprawled on the floor and bleeding from her head. Now, you or I, no matter who this happened to, we'd call for help or grab anything we could use as a bandage. But cousin, you must remember Minty's words. She was a neglected weed, so no care was given, no first aid administered. She came to and she was sent right back to the flax fields. And when the head wound became too severe, her temporary owners no longer wanted to deal with the half-dead Minty. So they sent her back to the Broadus home and to the care of Mama Rit. If you look at photos of Minty, now Harriet, as we know her, you can see a deep scar on her forehead, right where the weight made contact. What happened at the Bucktown General Store is like a fixed point in our timeline. Without this major plot point in Minty's life, who is to say if she would ever become the Harriet we know? This head wound and resulting narcolepsy and seizures, they chase her into her adult life, and it opens up this new spiritual experience for her. Because of this head wound and the lack of care from it, her dreams become vivid. She can see herself flying over the marshes and the farmlands of Maryland's eastern shore. And what's greater, like Joan of Arc before her, Minty swears she can hear the voice of God. For the rest of her life, when faced with moments of uncertainty, she'll stand still and listen for that voice to speak to her. That leads me to part 2, becoming the Harriet we know. Minty is all grown up now, y'all. She's learned to work the system in her favor, and she hires herself out to the farms around Dorchester County. The Brodess family is still broke, so they are happy to receive the income and could care less where the money's coming from. She's a small thing, much smaller than we ever expect our heroes to be, but that doesn't stop her from doing the work of men twice her size. She's trapping beavers and the like in the woods, and in between narcoleptic fits, she's using ox that she saved up her own money to purchase, mind you, and working timber and other agricultural fields. One thing for sure, two things for certain, our heroine is a hard worker, a trait that will follow her to her grave. At some point, she takes on the family name of Harriet, and she's married now to a freedman named John Tubman. Why John, a free man, would marry a slave woman is completely unknown. His children with Harriet would not be free like him. Instead, they would be owned by the Brodess family. That means their bodies, their fates are all decided by a poor white family who could care less about their slaves and do anything to stay afloat. Seems like, a setup for heartbreak. A heartbreak that Harriet knows all too well and voices very loudly to her husband, John. Before Harriet was born, one of her sisters was sold further south. And once she was old enough to understand, she had to see another sister attached to a chain gang and also sent deep, deep south. At one point, one of Harriet's brothers, Benjamin Ross, named after their father, Ben Ross, later Benjamin Ross is called by his free name, James Stewart, was even threatened with the auction block. The Brodesses, they were trying to stay financially afloat, as they often were, and they had no choice but to sell off assets. In an interview that James took with Benjamin Drew, author of A North Side View of Slavery, The Refugee, or The Narrative of Fugitive Slaves in Canada, James recounted, "The estate being in debt, I was imprisoned. Before I went to jail, my niece was hired out. Then her owner concluded to sell her. She was taken away from her children, handcuffed, and put into jail where I was. She was sold and carried away, leaving her children behind." A story all too familiar, one seen constantly, especially by the slaves in the poor rural area of Maryland. And this was a pattern that the Brodesses would follow. They would always move first to sell off their slave women. Though they may have been of weak constitution, these women, they were able to have children and make more slaves. I suppose that means that they were more valuable to someone, enough so that it put just enough money in the Brodess family accounts to stave off lawsuit squabbles with family or debt collectors. So you can imagine being ripped from the only home she knows, from the only family she has left, weighed heavily, heavily on Harriet's mind. Every time I saw a white man, Harriet would recount later to her biographers, I was afraid of being carried away. And somewhere in all of this, she was having dreams, vivid visions of a horseman coming to her to get her. Now, this is me editorializing here, but with all the talk of freedom and God, I imagine these horsemen to be kind of like, the four horsemen, apocalyptic even. death swooping in on a pale horse and sending her into the horrors of the deep south, away from her family, never to be tracked again by history. Her husband, John Tubman, did not have this fear and seemingly could care less about it. So, with the voice of God sounding in her head and the fear of being sold gnawing at her soul, Harriet tries to find a way out. First, she digs into the family lore. Maryland slaves, as it happens, weren't always slave for life. Depending upon the owner and their will, sometimes slaves would be set free like after 45, 50 years old. And rumor had it that Mama Rit was under such bondage, and the Brodess family should have turned her and her offspring away some time ago. So, Harriet, the hard worker she is, saved up some cash and went about hiring herself a lawyer to look into the grandfather's will of the man who owns her. I know it's a lot to keep up with, but stay with me. What resulted from hiring this lawyer was a fight between the Brodess family and their cousins over who exactly should own Rit and her children. Not the outcome Harriet had in mind, but this legal struggle would come up time and again to stop the Brodess family from selling Rit or her children. Of course, the question was never really should they be set free, so much for not being a lifelong slave. And, it also meant that time was ticking. The pale horseman was coming. Harriet was sick, as she often was, and laid up. Her husband, John, still the asshole, was not reported to take care of her during these bouts of illness. Word spread to Mr. Brodess, and he found this a great opportunity to get rid of Harriet. Though she was hardworking, she had a mind of her own, and she was troublesome. Plus, he had debts to pay and a family to feed. And she was a woman, the eldest remaining daughter of Mama Rit. And just like all the other daughters, he was sure he could fetch a good price for Harriet. So Mr. Brodess just had to go around the courts, and do what he perceived was the right thing to do. Word gets to Harriet about what's being planned, and laid up sick and unable to do anything for herself, Harriet communed with that voice of God in her head. With no strength in her body except for her faith, she prayed that her owner, Mr. Brodess, would just drop dead. And wouldn't you know it, her prayer was answered. Suddenly, and with no seeming cause, Mr. Brodess got sick and up and died. This taught Harriet something very important, a skill that us as hoodoos recognize. She was heard. In Harriet Tubman, Imagining a Life, Beverly Lowry writes, "It is now that Harriet Tubman begins to understand the powers of her gifts and the responsibility that they have settled upon her. The message is clear. If she asks God to kill a man, and that man is immediately struck down, God has anointed her as a disciple. He wants her to ask for what she needs and to be prepared to receive it. But she must ask judiciously, and afterward take up the cause herself, for she is on her own then, and the rest is up to her." So the stage is set. With Mr. Brodess dead and the ongoing lawsuits between cousins, it's only a matter of time before some white man comes sniffing around again on his pale horse. Growing up, she learned all the skills necessary to navigate the marshlands of the Eastern Shore and to run for her freedom. And, God is on her side, whispering in her ear. She just has to stand still enough to hear it. And just as important, she understood that no one was going to free her. There was no magic answer, no, movie cutscene. So if she was going to be free, she was going to have to run for it. Her first attempt was with 2 or 3 of her brothers. I won't go into detail, but let's just say her brothers wimped out. Sure, they could run, but, who was going to be there to greet them once they reached freedom? How far do they have to run to get to freedom? I mean, they've never actually left Dorchester County, so the promised lands in Pennsylvania seemed too far away to comprehend. They wanted to turn back. Harriet did not. She told them that this is not what God wanted for her, not what God wanted for them. He wanted them to keep going. In this moment, out in the woods, her brothers did not see the heroine, the warrior Harriet Tubman. No, they saw their crazy sister ranting about visions and voices who had no plan to see them through to safety. And, their family was still going to be broken. These men were leaving behind fiancés, girlfriends, wives, parents, children. So they picked her up and hauled her back to the plantation where she was loaned out to. By this point, Harriet had already made up her mind. She had the soul of a free woman. She just had to make it a reality. So she, did what her brother said. Harriet, from my research, she seems to be one of those folks who are like always broke, but also always people rich. Like she had a great knack at collecting people. She worked all over the county and she knew people who knew people who knew people. So she sought help. Harriet knew of this Quaker woman by the name of Hannah Levarton. Now listen, white folks get a bad rap during this era, as they should. The institution of slavery is fucking despicable. No one's disagreeing with that. We should take a second to recognize that there would not have been an underground railroad without Quakers like Hannah Levarton, who truly believed all men, no matter their skin color, would be judged equally before God, and that slavery had no place in the land of the faithful. Mrs. Levarton believed in this fact so much so that she was willing to break the law to help Harriet steal herself away. And make no mistake, an escaped slave was considered a thief who stole themselves from their masters. They were a product. So Mrs. Levarton gave Harriet a piece of paper to pass on and instructions on who to give it to when Harriet does decide to make a run for it. In return, Harriet gives Mrs. Levarton a quilt. Now, there's some myth here. Some say that there was a secret message for thieving escapees translated, into the quilt, sewn into the quilt. I can't be sure, but, I hope so. Now that she has help, now that she has some sort of direction, she knows that she should tell at least one person, so her family won't worry about her. She won't say much because, of course, the family needs plausible deniability when they're questioned, but she knows that she shouldn't just drop off the face of the earth either. Her brothers are out of the question. Their souls aren't free, not like her. She can't tell her mother, Mama Rit has already lost too many children, and she went full mama bear back when Mr. Brodess was alive and he tried to sell her youngest son. And that was like not too long ago. And her husband, I'm not even sure if her husband was even an option to tell. So she decides to tell Mary, a young black woman working in the kitchens of the Thompson plantation, where Harriet is currently being loaned out to. She draws Mary out of the kitchen, perhaps with a fun game or just to have a word. They get far enough from the house and Harriet gets serious. She searches for the words to tell her friend that she's going and asks her to relay the message to Mama Rit and everyone else. She'll be safe. God told her she would be safe. But no sooner does she open her mouth does A.C. Thompson, the owner of the plantation Harriet is being loaned out to right at this moment, comes into view. Now, A.C. Thompson was no stranger to Harriet. She had worked on his land many times, and so do her brothers and her father. And, sure, on Sundays, he's a minister and, maybe his betrothed, his fiance, who happens to be a Quaker woman, spoke to him about the kindness and the due diligence of being a good person and how slavery sucked. But none of that matters in this moment. Not the holiness, not, a good loving woman. None of that matters, because at this moment, he's the slave master. A slave master known to be hard on the slaves working for him. So hard, in fact, that just seeing his face as he rides up on a pale horse to Harriet and Mary puts something fierce, a spooked up, fierce spirit in Mary, and she scuttles back inside, leaving Harriet standing by herself in front of A.C. Thompson. Now, our girl Harriet, she don't flinch. A slave master has never heard her holler or seen her butt pucker before, and it's not going to happen now. No, she exchanged pleasant greetings with him, and then heads to the same gate that Master Thompson just rode through on his horse. As she walks to the gate, her spirit is moved to sing. Now, I don't know the melody, but the song she sings is a Negro spiritual, and it goes something like, "I'm sorry I'm going to leave you. Farewell, oh farewell. But I'll meet you in the morning. Farewell, oh farewell. I'll meet you in the morning. I'm bound for the promised land, to the other side of River Jordan, bound for the promised land." Now, she sings it loud enough that anybody nearby would hear it. And others in the field nearby, and inside the house where Mary just ran for her life, they all start to sing along with Harriet. Eventually, Harriet makes it to the gate. She opens it and casually strolls on through. For a moment, she loses her faith. And, with a tinge of doubt, she looks back at her temporary slave master. He's still sitting there, on horseback. Lord only knows what this man is thinking. Harriet, is an odd one. Always falling asleep, always dreaming, always hearing voices. He knows this. He's worked alongside of her. And like I said, he's a minister, so maybe he's just enjoying the fruits of his labor and listening to his slaves sing the Lord's praises. Maybe God himself held Master Thompson still. Maybe he knew what was going on and that Harriet was about to run. Maybe he found that out through his fiance and could just, generally care less, because technically Harriet was on loan. Harriet wasn't one of his slaves. Regardless, the meaning of the song had just gone over his head. All doubt left Harriet at that moment, and she locks the gate behind her and pats the lock as if to say, "Now you stay locked," and continues on her stroll down the road. Eventually, the stroll becomes a run. And she waits till dark to follow Mrs. LeVarton's instructions. She passes on the note and gets ferried from home to home, sometimes having to hide out in the marsh and the woods till it was safe enough to go to the next stop. So many nights before, Harriet sat at the precipice of freedom. The overseers and masters at the various plantations she worked, they painted this portrait of the terrain between here and Pennsylvania. And the landscape that they described was close to hell. Yet, as she walked barefoot, surefoot, along the Choptalk River, using her outdoor skills, freedom was within her reach. And she would not turn back till her body joined her soul in that freedom. Eventually, she does make it to the Delaware line. Harriet recounts to her biographer, Sarah Bradford. She says, "When I found I had crossed the line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." Harriet goes on to say, "I was free, but there was no one to welcome me in the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land." Now, when Harriet stole herself, she was a pioneer. Sure, others had run before. Hell, Nat Turner had even started a rebellion many years prior. But the Quakers and the abolitionists and navigators like Harriet, they were the start of the Underground Railroad as we understand it. If you wanted to be the master of your own fate, your soul first had to acknowledge that it was free. Then you had to take a leap of faith and just run for it. Even if that meant leaving all your loved ones behind. And even if it meant trusting those with the face of the people you were taught from birth to never turn your back to. Part 3. Mother Moses. Now that Mr. Brodess was, dead, it fell on Mrs. Eliza Brodess to put out a want ad for Harriet. You can find the ad with a simple Google search. It mentions that she and her brothers had escaped, but that wasn't completely true. Only Harriet made it to Philadelphia, the current promised land. Maybe once her brothers heard that Tubman ran for it, they followed after her, but they must have turned back at some point, as they still didn't have Quakers in their pocket or God in their ears. One of the leading forces that sent Harriet back into Maryland on her various trips was family. Most times she went back, it was to just get her family out, but the experience of running taught her that it came at a price. She had to, have a network of people. She needed money to exchange for food, shoes, train tickets. So she made friends with all the shot callers and the up and coming Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement. People like William Still, who's considered the grandfather of the Underground Railroad, and her state kinsman, Frederick Douglass, and, also Samuel Green. Now, Samuel Green was an interesting one. He was known to help escaping slaves, but he himself was never caught. He was a freed black man. Because they can never actually catch him helping his kinsmen, they jailed him for owning a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But I digress. There are a few escape stories I could tell you, but I'm going to tell you my 3 favorites. I encourage you to look into them. I encourage you to look into all of her stories, because I'm not going to go into full details, but I hope you get, a feel of Harriet's bravery and her blessings. The first escape is of Harriet's niece, Keziah Boley. Word spread all the way up to Harriet in Philadelphia that Keziah was going to be sold. And it for sure was going to happen, because whatever legal issues that needed to be resolved were no longer standing in the way. This, would not do. Harriet would not see another of her lady folk sent deep south to work cotton fields, never to be heard of again. So she raised money for passage and connected with her brother-in-law, Tom Tubman, in Baltimore. From there, Harriet sent word that if Keziah and her family escaped, made it as far as Baltimore, she'd help them the rest of the way. A few things were on their side. First, Keziah's husband, John Boley, was a free man. And second, John Boley was also a skilled navigator, a skilled watersman. Side note, we don't think about that when we think of slaves. We think cotton, tobacco, Negro spirituals. But, make no mistake, the most valuable laborers on the plantation will be considered skilled tradespeople today. Back to the story. It's time for the auction. Keziah is standing up there, perhaps her child in her arms. Good deal, 2 for the price of 1. The bid goes up. There's a lot of back and forth, numbers flying around. Eventually, the final bid is called. Who's Keziah's new owner, you ask? It's her husband, John Boley. Now, no one thought anything of it. It's perhaps rare, but not unheard of, for a husband to buy his wife's freedom. There's only one problem with this plan. John Boley doesn't have enough money for the bid. His pockets completely empty, not even dust. After this bid, it's lunchtime. The auctioneer takes Keziah and puts her someplace safe, then, heads for his midday meal. John goes to Keziah, unsure how it's going to play out. Call it luck, call it fate, call it an act of God. But the auctioneer forgets to lock up Keziah. No chains, no lock cell, none of that. So, they run for it. Now, maybe they knew of a hiding spot. maybe they met up with some old white ladies willing to look the other way. Eliza Brodess was not very well liked by anyone, really. But Keziah, John, and their baby hid out in the cellar till dark. Then they steal away on a boat toward Baltimore, where Aunt Harriet awaits. Now, I'm from Baltimore. I stood near the site where Keziah was going to be auctioned off. For my mother and I to get to Dorchester County Courthouse, we had to go through tunnels, over bridges, and spend like almost 2 hours singing songs in the car. I can't imagine what that journey would have been like on a boat. But, they made it to Baltimore. Now, Aunt Harriet didn't guide their hands the entire way, not like she does for others, but her example was set. John saw his chance, one that hadn't happened before, and I promise you would never happen again, and ran with his family. And in turn, Harriet did what she set out to do. She would be there to see others to freedom. My second favorite escape story involves Mr. Tubman. At this point, Harriet fell into a rhythm. Work all spring and summer serving the rich whites in Philly and New Jersey. She had established herself in the community, built a home for herself, She made a nest, and she was ready to get her husband. She even purchased him a suit to wear. Even though John Tubman was a free man, traveling with her would definitely get him and her into trouble. So, John had to look the part of a free man, hence the suit. So she journeys back into hell and risks her own freedom. The need to keep her family together, still pushing her movements. Once back in Dorchester, she sends word to John to meet her via a messenger. She waits for him. In my mind, she's, tending to the suit and pondering what life's going to be like now that their freedom is so close. When the messenger comes back, John's not with him. Instead, the messenger passes along some pretty devastating information. John Tubman has shacked up with a new lady. No one ever told her this. Not Tom Tubman of Baltimore, not anyone in her network, not even God whispered it to her. To say that Harriet was angry would be an understatement. She made vows to this man before God. She risked her freedom to come back to him, to reunite their small family. And John just forgot about her like she was dead. In a 1865 interview, Harriet says that she dropped John from her heart at that point. But, she keeps the name Tubman. It kind of reminds me of how Tina Turner, she told Ike, I don't want nothing from you except for your name. At the resolve of both women's marriages, they were notorious, Harriet Tubman, Tina Turner, like they needed the name. This was a good move on Harriet's part because the blacks, the enslaved, found out that Mrs. Tubman was in the county. And if they wanted to be free, like the bullies, like her, they need only to take that leap and put their faith in Tubman and her network. And Harriet vowed to help as many as she could, as many that were willing. So, what was it like to run with Harriet, once that she's an established conductor of the Underground Railroad? Whispers would spread that Harriet Tubman is in town. Then the songs would sound. Go down Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. That meant that the whispers were true. Harriet would start the song, a call for all those souls who wanted to be free, but their bodies were not. Of course, eventually, the white slave owners would catch on and put a stop to the singing, but that never really stopped the songs. It just made them quieter, like hums on the wind. Those seeking freedom would boldly state their intentions as well and seek out Harriet's family and let them know that, they were ready to take that leap whenever Harriet came back to town, Case in point, Josiah Bailey is a skilled laborer in the Dorchester County area. He was viciously beaten by his master for no other reason than that his master could viciously beat him, establish authority. Once Josiah could move again, he hopped on a boat and he found Ben Ross, Harriet's father. Josiah walked right up to Ben and said, "The next time Moses is in town, let me know." Ben Ross and Mama Rit at this point were both old and too old to work, so they were free, and would become a crucial point on Harriet's Underground Railroad stops, sometimes even the first stop. So, next time Moses is in town, let me know. That name Moses, it's stuck. Even Harriet's biographer, Sarah Bradford, she calls her book The Moses of Her People. And just like Moses, Harriet had an Old Testament level of fire in her heart. When it was time to leave, it was time to leave. Her brothers taught her that there was to be no wishy-washy behavior. Harriet would come to get her brothers and her sister Rachel on many occasions, that need to keep her family together driving her. And they would always have some reason why they could not go. Children would be left behind. The moon was too full. The time of the year was all wrong. And each time, Harriet would leave them and take anyone else willing to make that journey. If you had a child, you had to give them some kind of tonic to keep them quiet. Slave catchers, spurred on by the Fugitive Slave Act, were lurking in the woods. You had to move quiet and quick, and you had to be of mind to follow old Moses's directions as she gave them. No wiggle room. Once, towards the end of the Underground Railroad, Harriet had a group with her. For whatever reason, communications had broken down and their safe house was no longer safe. Everyone around had panicked, but they waited for Harriet for Moses's instructions. She sat still, listened to that voice of God, and led the group of men, women, and babies into this small, tall, grass-covered island in the middle of a marsh. Everyone was wet, everyone was miserable, and illness was inevitable. But they did it. And the slave catchers came close enough to touch, but they never found the group. And, if someone did not follow instructions and they decided that they wanted to run back, to go to the devil they know instead of to an unknown freedom, Harriet said point blank that she would shoot them dead, because dead slaves don't talk. Harriet, Mother Moses, later says, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was of two things I had the right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man should take me alive." Eventually, Mother Moses did get her brothers out. She even got her mother and father out when they were warned, surprisingly by A.C. Thompson, that they were about to be arrested for helping Harriet. And Mother Moses got countless others out of bondage, not stopping at Philadelphia. Like I said, the Fugitive Slave Act, made things hard. And it also made sure that nowhere in the land of Uncle Sam was safe. No, she got them all the way up to current day Ontario, Canada. And as a conductor, she never lost a passenger. Part 4. General Tubman. Now, all of this leads me to the third escape story, and this one was military sanctioned. Long before Lincoln caved and signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Harriet had already had a vision of her people being free, like a literal vision. When she woke up from her dream, sanctioned and ordained by God, she rejoiced like it was New Year's Day. Still, she was early, like couple years early. At a conference in Massachusetts on the topic of Abraham Lincoln, Harriet says, "They may send the flower of their young men down south to die of fever in the summer and the ague in the winter. For it is cold down there, though it is down south. God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing. Lincoln is a great man and I am a poor nigger. But this nigger can tell Master Lincoln how to save money and young men. He can do it by setting the niggers free." So, when war broke out, Harriet was ready. At this point, the radical white men in her network looked at her as a value to the cause. John Brown, before he died in a guerrilla attempt to push the abolition movement forward, he even referred to Harriet as General Tubman. So, with an unofficial military call, Harriet made her way down to Hilton Head, South Carolina, seemingly to be a spy and a disruptor. Now, our girl Harriet, was notorious. Mother Moses, sure. But that was Maryland. That was the North, the up South in the North. We're in low country South Carolina. Entirely different culture to the one she knew. Freedom for her, was possible because the line to freedom was only a couple states away. Well, at least until the United States government moved the goalpost to Canada. But for the folks of South Carolina, the folks in the deep South, war was the only way to get them out. Harriet struggled at first understanding the language, the Geechee, the Gullah Geechee. They have their own language, and it was hard for her to understand. But she did embed herself into the community. She nursed those who needed it with root work. She fed those who needed it with pies or whatever she can get her hands on. She even set up a bathhouse for the Black residents. Their efforts, these efforts led her to Walter Plowden. Mr. Plowden, a man of the community who was skilled in the waterways and coastal islands of South Carolina, a Black man. Still, she couldn't do more than this because Blacks at this point could not yet serve in the fight for their own freedom. Eventually, with a forced hand, DC had no choice but to allow Blacks to fight for the side of the Union. Harriet and her right-hand man, Mr. Walter Plowden, they teamed up with this white military man named James Montgomery and his regiment of all Black troops. James Montgomery. Okay, like the Quaker women who helped Harriet escape all those many years ago, Montgomery was an abolitionist. But he was like a little more Old Testament about it. I think that's the best way for me to put that. He was like that guerrilla warfare man, John Brown, I mentioned earlier. By his peers, Montgomery was described as splendid, but impulsive and changeable, never plans far ahead and goes off at a tangent. And another person said, not harsh or cruel, but a singular mixture of fanaticism, vanity, and genius. The best person, though, to describe how Montgomery felt is Montgomery himself. He said, y'all get this, he said, Southerners must be made to feel that this is a real war and that they are to be swept away by the hand of God like the Jews of old. What? From what my research dug up, Montgomery and Harriet, they seem to be cut from the same cloth, basically. Okay, so that's our players. We have our leader, Harriet Tubman, and her right-hand man and navigator, Mr. Plowden, and burn it all to the ground, military man, Mr. Montgomery. So let's set the scene. Their mission was to disrupt the supply chain and to liberate the labor force. Montgomery had 3 small river-worthy ships and a regiment of newly trained Black soldiers. I don't know, if I was one of those soldiers, knowing that Tubman was in the room where decisions were made would give me a little courage. This is war, and the people fighting for your freedom, they don't know the perils of slavery, but Harriet does. And she's proven that she's a solid and unmovable force. In the cover of night, they all make their way up the Combahee. That's a river. I hope I said that right, Combahee. Plowden's expertise is necessary for this run. Much like the marshes and waterways of Maryland, either you know and you're safe, or you don't know and you drown. Okay, so we have the mission. Their destination is a plantation that grows rice. In her book, Harriet Tubman, Imagining a Life, Lowry writes, rice farmers in South Carolina have grown even fatter than the bobolinks. In 1850, 257 plantations along 10 of the state's rivers produced nearly 80,000 tons of rice. And in 1860, 9 of the 14 slaveholders in the entire state who owned more than 500 slaves were rice planters. They have learned from their West African slaves how to put tidal culture to use. A great percentage of the enslaved workers come from Gambia River and the Rice Coast. So, when Harriet and Plowden and Montgomery show up, people are in various states of work and leisure. Some were cooking rice for breakfast. Some started their day and were hoeing in the fields. The Confederates, the rebels, were warned before not to send false reports, and they couldn't be sure at first that the Union was actually at shore. So instead of ringing the alarms, Lowry writes, they passed messages that there were Negro troops on the shore. The messages were true. The Negro troops popped up on shore, clad in Union blue, ready to fight, and the enslaved needed no other prompt to run for freedom. Harriet recalls, I never saw such a sight. Some was getting their breakfast, just taking their pots of rice off the fire, and they put a cloth on top their heads and set that on. Rice still smoking. Young ones hanging on behind, one hand around the mother's forehead to hold on, and the other hand digging into the rice pot. Eating with all his might. Some folks had even packed up essentials, tied them in white cloth, and just ran for it. Some had 2 children, one on each hip, just gunning it to the Union soldiers. As the chaos broke out, the white rebels tried their best to wrangle the fleeing laborers. Didn't the blacks know that the Union was the worst option? They were just going to be sold to bondage in Cuba. In Cuba! The Union didn't guarantee freedom. But just like those who Harriet ushered to Canada, the blacks didn't care. Wherever they were headed had to be better than where they were. So Harriet wrangled them onto the riverboats. Montgomery gave the call for the soldiers to provide cover, and Plowden navigated them the hell out of there. And when they were far enough away, Montgomery gave the call to burn it all down. The bridges, the fields, the homes, burn it all to the ground. Real Old Testament wrath. When the chaos broke out on the larger boats ferrying people away from the burning mass, that used to be their home, their jail cell, Montgomery called to old Moses to calm her people. So Harriet sang a song, and that song stopped everybody in their tracks and made everyone sing along. And she didn't stop singing until everyone was safe. The number of people Harriet freed during her Underground Railroad days is not easily calculated. She took 19 trips and freed people, anywhere between 70 and 300. It's wild. But this particular raid with Plowden and Montgomery, it is accepted as a known fact that Harriet liberated between 600 and 800 people. Even still, with all her work as a nurse and a spy, she was denied her military pension when the time came. Even with people like Montgomery vouching for her work, it wasn't until she remarried a Civil War soldier and that man died that she was able to collect on his pension. So yeah, that's my favorite stories surrounding Harriet Tubman, from Minty to General Tubman. She never did get her sister Rachel out. Rachel was sold deep south and never heard of again, just like the sisters before her. Rachel wouldn't take that leap to freedom if it meant leaving her children behind. But Harriet was able to get the rest of her family. And for the rest of her life, even during the trips and the raids, she still suffered the symptoms related to her head trauma as a child. The visions, the weak constitution, falling asleep randomly, the voice of God, all of that. And even at an old age, she would be called upon to speak on freedom. Susan B. Anthony, child, y'all know who she is, the white lady who pushed for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony, the one who knew that women's rights wouldn't be a thing until black men can vote. That Susan B. Anthony. She called upon Harriet to speak at suffrage meetings. Now that makes sense. Harriet had the courage to do what grown men could not do. She fought in a war right there on the front lines. And I think something to keep in mind is that she knew of horrors and hardships that the white women she was speaking to would never, ever suffer. And, she came out on the other end, free and respected. Now, she was poor, very, very poor, but still free and respected. Some hoodoos call on her spirit in times of distress. When they need to navigate a way through hardships, they light a candle and they summon her level of strength, And that makes sense to me because call her what you want, Minty, Harriet, Mother Moses, General Tubman. She was a history maker, arguably a key figure on the ground, pushing the movement forward for freedom. So, she was one of the best to ever do it. All right. Thank you, cousins, for joining me in this story about Mother Moses. It was a long process for me. And as much as I tried, I'm sure some details may be mixed up or a piece of her story is missing. If you can get to the Eastern Shore and take the Harriet Tubman Trail, I would recommend it. Stand where she stood, get a feel for where history was made. It was an amazing experience. I also enjoyed reading Beverly Lowry's book, Harriet Tubman, Imagining a Life. She really brought the stories to life for me. You can also check out The Moses of Her People by Sarah Bradford to get as close as you can get firsthand account, from Harriet herself. No questions today. This was a long one. So before I go, cousin, I want to let you know that you deserve the world. We live a life built on hard-fought freedoms of our ancestors. Those like Harriet had a righteous dream of living in peace with their family and in pursuit of a happiness not dictated by others. We can even have that too, Our struggle might not be as epic, but it's still our struggle. And Harriet sets the example that if you take the leap, glory will follow. And if you call for your blessings, they will come to you. I'll see you guys next time.